The city of Redwood Falls had always projected a quaint, almost storybook charm to outsiders. Tourists strolling through its downtown marveled at the cobblestone streets, the iconic clock tower, and the wide, lazy river that wound its way through neighborhoods lined with elm trees. But beneath that picturesque exterior, a storm had been brewing for years, a storm fueled by fear, corruption, and deep-seated prejudice that festered among those with power. On a warm evening in late June, just before sunset draped Redwood Falls in a swirl of orange and lavender, a confrontation was set in motion that would forever change the fate of the city. Two officers who had long commanded an unspoken empire of intimidation were about to cross paths with a single person they believed posed no real threat, someone who might quietly submit to their authority. They couldn't have been more wrong. Before we dive in, folks, I just want to say thank you all for being here. If you're excited for this story, remember to drop a like, hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching this from. Now, let's get right into it, because things are about to heat up in Redwood Falls. Officer Madeline Green and Officer Harriet Bowers were not just your average patrol officers. They were known throughout Redwood Falls for their cold demeanors, their willingness to bend the rules, and their unsettling and often blatant bigotry. Most people in the community were too frightened to speak out. They simply obeyed whatever demands these officers placed on them. The Redwood Falls Police Department was relatively small, but Green and Bowers had a knack for forming alliances with just the right people. Their circle of influence included a handful of local politicians, a real estate mogul who thrived on displacing families from historically black neighborhoods, and a couple of higher-ups in the department who turned a blind eye to their behavior. While Redwood Falls itself prided its image on tolerance and togetherness, certain corners of local government had grown increasingly bold in protecting the officers' questionable conduct. To those who got in their way, Green and Bowers were known to dish out unprovoked tickets, orchestrate random property searches, and occasionally use physical intimidation. They kept these transgressions carefully veiled behind claims of just doing our job. For too long, the city had allowed it. People complained, but official investigations somehow always fizzled out. Witnesses were too scared to testify. Victims, often from marginalized communities, felt their voices had no power against the might of the Redwood Falls PD. But the truth was bigger than two officers on a power trip. It reached deeper into Redwood Falls, into the halls of the courthouse, into after-hours social clubs where local officials rubbed elbows, forging shadowy deals to protect each other. Everyone in the know called it the Empire. It was more than just a joke name. It denoted something real and oppressive, a system that favored a select few while stomping on anyone who dared demand justice. Judge Adeline Reyes was not from Redwood Falls. She had been appointed to the Redwood County Superior Court only 3 months prior. Coming from the bustling city of Grand Bridge, where she had overseen a major anti-corruption initiative, Judge Reyes had quite the reputation. Short in stature but towering in presence, she carried herself with calm precision. She was known for her unwavering dedication to fairness and her fierce contempt for abuse of power. Though Redwood Falls seemed quiet on the surface, Judge Reyes had heard rumors. Whispers about police officers who terrorized local businesses, a supposed real estate scheme, and wrongful arrests. Locals she'd met during her first weeks in town always hesitated before confiding they felt Redwood Falls wasn't the same place it had been 20 years ago. She dismissed none of these comments. After all, Reyes had been specifically assigned to Redwood County for her expertise in rooting out unethical systems. Though Redwood Falls was considered small compared to her previous turf, she suspected it was no different in terms of under-the-table dealings. From her corner office on the top floor of the old courthouse, she watched. She listened, and she waited for solid evidence that might reveal exactly how corrupted Redwood Falls truly was. It was at the edge of the city, in a rundown parking lot behind a shuttered hardware store, that everything finally reached a breaking point. Judge Reyes was driving a borrowed sedan. The clerk at the courthouse had recommended it because her personal vehicle was in the shop for routine maintenance. After finishing a long day of hearings, she decided to stop by a local diner on the outskirts of Redwood Falls known for its homemade pies. Unbeknownst to the judge, officers Madeline Green and Harriet Bowers were staking out that neighborhood. Officially, they were monitoring suspicious activity, but in truth, they were looking for anyone they could profile. anyone whose presence in their town they deemed out of place. And in Redwood Falls, which was predominantly white, any person of color was immediately singled out for random checks. Judge Reyes, a woman of mixed heritage, African-American mother, Latina father, parked her car and stepped out onto the cracked pavement. She wore dark slacks, a simple blouse, and a determined expression. She had no intention of making trouble. She simply needed to stretch her legs and enjoy a slice of pie before heading home. Behind her, the squad car's headlights flashed. Officers Green and Bowers stepped out. Green walked with a confident swagger that was designed to intimidate, while Bowers, slightly shorter, let her partner lead the show. They approached the judge, who glanced back, already wary. "Ma'am," Officer Green called, hand resting on the side of her holster. "We need to ask you a few questions." Judge Reyes stiffened. "Is there a problem, officer?" "We got a call about a suspicious vehicle matching your car's description," Bowers said, trying to sound casual, but the tension in her voice was obvious. Reyes had seen this scenario 1,000 times before, law enforcement profiling based on race, pulling people aside for no reason but to assert dominance. She could have explained she was a judge, but something in her wanted to see just how far these officers would go. "I'm on my way to the local diner," Reyes replied. "Not sure how that's suspicious." "No need to get defensive," Green said. "We just want to see some ID." Instead of launching into a speech about her credentials, Reyes quietly fished out her driver's license. She handed it over without a word. Both officers studied it, then stiffened visibly. The name Adeline Reyes was well known in Redwood Falls, even if the officers had never actually met her in person. At least not yet. "Wait, you're..." Green started to say, but Reyes could see the sudden storm of confusion and hostility behind the officer's eyes. "I don't care who you are," she continued in a harder tone. "In Redwood Falls, we have rules. Mind stepping back into your vehicle?" Bowers said, her voice low. "No," replied Reyes calmly. "I'd rather stand." Both officers exchanged a glance, one that spoke volumes of their usual, well-rehearsed routine. This was typically the moment a suspect would cower in fear. This was where people realized these officers held all the power. But Judge Reyes remained steady, unmoved. Their intimidation ramped up. "Ma'am," Green repeated, "get in the car." Now, Judge Reyes felt her adrenaline spike, but she refused to show her nerves. "I haven't done anything to warrant this treatment," she said, holding their gaze. "If there's a valid reason for this stop, I'd like to know what it is." That's when Green took a brazen step forward, forcibly snatching the small black wallet that contained the judge's court ID. She didn't open it. Her hand seemed to be trembling ever so slightly with anger. Then, in a moment that would change everything, Officer Madeline Green lashed out. She slapped Judge Reyes across the face, hard. A cold hush seemed to blanket the entire parking lot. The shock of the slap jolted Reyes's head to one side. For a split second, she simply stood there, stunned. Bowers's eyes widened in disbelief, while Green's lips curled in a mixture of triumph and twisted satisfaction. But the victory was short-lived. In Redwood Falls, certain calls to 911 triggered specialized protocols, especially calls placed to a private emergency line known only to judges and top officials. It was a direct link to dispatch that would verify the identity of the caller immediately. Judge Reyes, still reeling from the sudden blow, quietly reached into her pants pocket, fished out her phone, and pressed a single, pre-programmed emergency contact. The phone rang only once before connecting. "Dispatch," a calm voice said. "This is Redwood Falls Courthouse line. Please identify yourself." "This is Judge Adeline Reyes," she said, her voice trembling slightly with anger, yet still in control. "I've just been assaulted by 2 Redwood Falls police officers in the old hardware store lot on 5th and Bingham." The moment Officer Bowers realized Reyes was calling dispatch directly, panic set in. She grabbed Green by the arm. "Stop her," she hissed. But in that instant, Reyes had already stated her name, her location, and the nature of the emergency. Protocol demanded a rapid response. The wheels were in motion. "Judge Reyes, we have your exact location," the dispatch officer replied. "Units are en route." In the span of 4 minutes from the moment the call went out, Redwood Falls would never be the same. On the surface, it was just an escalation of a routine traffic stop gone wrong. But in truth, it was the match igniting a tinderbox of corruption. Judge Reyes had effectively triggered an emergency that would bring certain elements of Redwood Falls out into the open. All the dirty secrets that Green, Bowers, and their associates had worked so hard to keep hidden would soon face scrutiny. The police cruiser that arrived in response was helmed by Sergeant Benjamin Haas, a dedicated officer who prided himself on upholding the law and had grown increasingly unsettled by the rumors he'd heard about his colleagues. Haas, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a perpetually worried brow, had no clue that the two officers in question were Green and Bowers until he swung the squad car into the parking lot. When he saw them and recognized Judge Reyes, he froze. The tension clung to the air like a thick fog. "What the?" Haas started. "Sergeant," Judge Reyes greeted him, her posture unwavering. Her cheek still burned from the slap, though she refused to raise a hand to it. "I trust you know me, or at least my name." Haas nodded slowly. "Judge Reyes, what happened here?" Green, eyes wild with anger and perhaps the dawning realization she'd made a grave mistake, opened her mouth. "She refused a lawful order, Sergeant. She was obstructing us." Judge Reyes cut in, voice measured and cold. "She slapped me. Without cause. I will see that a formal complaint is filed." There was a moment where it looked as though Green might explode into further violence, but Bowers placed a shaky hand on her partner's arm, cautioning her to back down for now. Haas, though outranked in the department by those who favored Green and Bowers, followed standard protocol. He separated the parties, took statements, and radioed for additional support because a superior court judge had just alleged battery by law enforcement. In Redwood Falls, the fallout was immediate. Word spread faster than wildfire. Everyone with a vested interest in the status quo, everyone in the empire, knew they had to do damage control. And so, from that evening on, Redwood Falls found itself at a crossroads. The unstoppable force of Judge Reyes's demand for accountability had collided with the immovable object of a corrupt system determined to protect its own. Now, let's pause for a moment. If you've been glued to this story so far, make sure you drop a like on this video and subscribe if you haven't already. Your support helps us uncover and share these powerful tales. And don't forget to let me know in the comments where you're watching this from. It's always incredible to see how far our community reaches. Alright, back to Redwood Falls. As the days passed, the deeper workings of the empire began to unravel. Decades ago, Redwood Falls had a police department built on trust and camaraderie. Then, a small group discovered they could leverage official positions to secure lucrative side deals. They facilitated suspicious property transfers, allowed certain developers to push out tenants from prime real estate, and enforced unwritten laws that shielded the wealthy and powerful from scrutiny. Minorities, the economically disadvantaged, and anyone who dared ask questions were systematically harassed, discredited, or even jailed on fabricated charges. At the center of this web stood Captain Lawrence Eddings. Eddings was an imposing figure in his early 50s. He'd served in Redwood Falls law enforcement for nearly 3 decades, rising through the ranks on a blend of cunning manipulation and political alliances. Rumor had it that Eddings was unstoppable because he had dirt on everyone: city council members, local business tycoons, even a few judges. If you crossed him, you risked having your secrets exposed. He had a special fondness for officers Green and Bowers, who'd proven themselves invaluable enforcers of his brand of law and order. Though his position demanded a public facade of impartial leadership, behind closed doors, Eddings often encouraged them to target specific neighborhoods and close down certain businesses under the guise of crime prevention. The unspoken truth: Eddings's close friends then swooped in to buy those properties at rock-bottom prices. This arrangement was beneficial for those who wanted wealth and power at the expense of justice. But an aggressive act against an appointed judge was a scorching red flag, one the empire couldn't ignore. The moment Green laid hands on Judge Reyes, an alarm went off in their tight-knit circle. They had messed with the wrong woman. Calls were made. Politicians whispered in back rooms. A city council member who owed her seat to Eddings arranged private meetings to figure out damage control. The official spin was that officers Green and Bowers had responded to a suspicious person call, and that the suspect resisted. They circulated an edited bodycam snippet showing Reyes from behind, looking non-compliant. But the uncut footage told the real story. Green, with pure hatred in her eyes, slapping Reyes unprovoked. In Redwood Falls, it was typical for people who had been wronged by these cops to settle quietly, but a judge was another matter entirely. Multiple attempts were made to coerce Reyes into dropping her complaint. Anonymous phone calls threatened her reputation. Flyers with misinformation about her were slipped under doors around town, painting her as a radical judge from the city trying to ruin Redwood Falls. Despite the intimidation efforts, Reyes pressed forward. A week after the incident, a modest crowd gathered at Redwood Falls Courthouse. Dozens of local residents, Black, white, Hispanic, and Asian, came together to demand transparency and accountability. They held signs reading, "End police brutality," and "Justice for all." The local newspaper, the Redwood Gazette, ran a front-page story titled "Judge Accuses Local PD of Assault. Investigation Underway." Even a small television crew from a neighboring city arrived to document the protest. Many Redwood Falls officers, including Sergeant Haas, watched from a distance. Haas, a man who still believed in the notion of honor, found himself torn. He was disillusioned with the department's attempts to bury the truth, but was also aware of the personal cost of defying Captain Eddings. Some younger officers quietly spoke to him in hallways, murmuring their support for doing the right thing. But they were afraid. The system was so entrenched that to buck it meant risking their careers, or worse. Meanwhile, Green and Bowers were temporarily placed on administrative leave, but they showed zero remorse. Bowers, whose aggression was usually overshadowed by Green's brashness, nearly attacked a news reporter who tried to ask about the incident. "Get out of my face," she barked, hiding behind sunglasses that only partly concealed her smoldering anger. Green, for her part, refused to speak to the press, offering only sneers when confronted. Together, they retreated into the protective arms of Captain Eddings, who assured them he'd fix this mess. Despite the turmoil, court cases continued. The day finally arrived when the first hearing related to the assault was scheduled. Redwood Falls buzzed with tension. The public wanted a spectacle. Would Judge Reyes preside over her own case? Legal ethics forbade that, of course, so a visiting judge from another county was brought in. But Reyes's presence in the courthouse that day, along with the public and the press, added an electrifying charge. It was a preliminary hearing to determine whether there was enough evidence for charges against Green and Bowers. Eddings's influence had turned the district attorney's office into a swirling mess of indecision, with staff uncertain whether to proceed or to try to cover for the officers. Ultimately, the assistant district attorney, Linda Perry, decided to do her job. She presented the uncut body cam footage, capturing the slap in horrifying clarity. When the video played, a hush fell over the courtroom. The sound of the slap reverberated through the small speaker like a gunshot. "Oh my God," someone whispered in the gallery. Others simply gasped. Green could be seen leaning forward, fury distorting her face, before her hand lashed out. The video ended with Judge Reyes calling dispatch, her voice trembling slightly, but full of resolve. The visiting judge made no immediate ruling, but the evidence was there. He scheduled another court date and set strict conditions for Green and Bowers pending the investigation. The two officers stormed out without comment. Yet, Redwood Falls began to sense that the untouchable empire might be cracking. The tension wasn't just external, it leaked into the department itself. Rumors circulated that some officers had threatened to expose the corruption if leadership continued to shield Green and Bowers. One of these whistleblowers was Officer Carlita Ruiz, a young Latina recruit who had once admired Green for her assertiveness, until she saw the bigotry up close. One evening, after a particularly heated meeting among the staff, words boiled over. Officer Ruiz confronted Green in the station hallway. "You've disgraced us all," she accused, voice trembling with barely contained emotion. "Assaulting a judge? Harassing people based on race? How can you keep pretending you protect and serve?" Green scoffed, stepping inches from Ruiz's face. "Watch who you talk to. You people come in here and think you can change everything. I've been here my whole life. Redwood Falls belongs to us." "Us? You mean racists?" The word hung in the air, stinging Green. In that charged second, Harriet Bowers intervened, stepping between them. But Green, in a violent outburst, shoved her aside and lunged at Ruiz. A brief scuffle ensued, with other officers rushing in to break it up. The station erupted into chaos, and once again, Redwood Falls PD's cracks were laid bare. This time, multiple officers witnessed Green's unprovoked aggression. Some had it on their phone cameras. By the time Captain Eddings arrived, the damage was done. Judge Reyes watched developments from her chambers. Though she tried to remain impartial, her personal involvement in the case made it impossible to stay distant. She began to compile every piece of evidence she could find: documented complaints, eyewitness accounts, property records tied to Eddings's associates. She had learned a long time ago that corruption is rarely isolated. If you see one weed, there's probably a tangle of roots beneath the surface. But exposing such a well-entrenched empire required teamwork. Reyes reached out to local community leaders, heads of churches, grassroots activists, and small business owners who had felt the pinch of police harassment. They met covertly in homes and cafes, discussing how to shed light on Redwood Falls' hidden rot. Some were reluctant to speak out, terrified of retribution. However, once they saw the surge of public protests and the unwavering determination in Reyes's eyes, many found the courage to step forward. While these alliances formed, the Redwood Falls PD experienced internal warfare. Sergeant Haas found himself dodging accusations from Eddings that he'd lost control of his station. Younger officers demanded transparency. Captain Eddings threatened demotions. The old guard closed ranks around Green and Bowers, while a new generation demanded accountability. The department was split down the middle, teetering precariously. All this turmoil led to a near tragedy that further stoked the flames. One evening, an after-hours vigil was held by the old riverfront park to honor those who had suffered from police abuse. Families lit candles along the bank, drifting small paper lanterns on the water to symbolize hope. The atmosphere was calm, somber, but unified. Unbeknownst to them, Green and Bowers, still on suspension, were skulking nearby. Fueled by anger, humiliation, and perhaps alcohol, they showed up in plain clothes, determined to intimidate the group. They hurled racial slurs, mocking the vigil. Several community members tried to ignore them, but the tension was undeniable. When a teenage boy, Miguel Lopez, stepped forward and told Green to leave, she lunged at him. In the confusion, Bowers brandished a firearm, her personal weapon, not her service pistol. Fear rippled through the crowd. Fortunately, Officer Ruiz, who had quietly attended the vigil in solidarity, stepped between the two suspended cops and the crowd. Ruiz managed to talk Bowers down, urging her to see reason. In the end, no shots were fired, but the moment shattered any last vestige of authority Green and Bowers may have clung to. Videos captured on cell phones revealed them spouting hateful language, brandishing a weapon at unarmed civilians. The Redwood Falls community was outraged. The final embers of any public support for Green and Bowers were extinguished, replaced by a fierce call for their arrest and the immediate resignation of Captain Eddings. Amid the uproar, Redwood Falls got an unexpected visitor, State Attorney General Maribel Contreras. She had long been an ally to Judge Reyes. They had worked together on corruption cases in Grand Bridge. After Reyes sent her a discreet message detailing the Redwood Falls situation, Contreras decided to pay a personal visit. A formidable figure known for her directness, Contreras requested a private meeting with Captain Eddings at City Hall. In the meeting, she made it crystal clear that the state's office would begin an official investigation into Redwood Falls PD. Eddings tried to defend himself and his department, but Contreras wasn't swayed by platitudes. She pointed out that the footage of Green and Bowers at the vigil had gone viral, and that the Redwood Gazette had released a damning editorial about systemic racism and corruption in Redwood Falls PD. Eddings could practically feel his empire collapsing around him. He tried to bargain. If the state investigation were to remain discreet, he'd arrange immediate resignations for Green and Bowers. Contreras just shook her head. Captain, Redwood Falls needs accountability, not quiet deals. The truth will come out. As the investigation ramped up, an anonymous leak sent Redwood Falls into a tailspin. A file, allegedly compiled by an officer in the department, was shared on social media. It detailed a shadowy list of influential people who had either bribed or been bribed by police leadership. It showed property transfers that indicated a pattern of forced displacement, all tied to Eddings's close friend, real estate mogul Charles Fletcher. The leak included emails suggesting Fletcher had been funneling donations to city officials who supported Eddings's agenda, as well as transcripts of phone calls that linked Green and Bowers to racially charged enforcement directives. Redwood Falls was aghast. The local newspaper's office received dozens of calls from concerned citizens and outraged activists. A local blogger wrote a scathing piece titled, "Our City's Cancer. It's Time to Cut It Out." With public anger at a boiling point, Redwood Falls saw a large-scale protest in front of City Hall. Hundreds gathered with signs demanding Eddings must go and justice for Judge Reyes. For many who lived under the weight of the empire for years, it was a moment of catharsis and hope. Finally, the day arrived for the formal charges against Green and Bowers to be heard: aggravated battery, official misconduct, and brandishing a firearm while under suspension. The courtroom overflowed with community members, reporters, and off-duty officers. Judge Reyes sat quietly in the gallery. She was not presiding, as her personal involvement deemed it a conflict of interest. The visiting judge from another county, known for his fairness, took the bench. The assistant district attorney presented a comprehensive case, complete with the body cam footage, eyewitness testimonies, and video from the Riverfront Park vigil. Green and Bowers had hired high-priced lawyers, but even they seemed to struggle under the sheer weight of evidence. In a dramatic moment, Officer Ruiz took the stand, recounting in detail Green's unprovoked violence at the station and the vile remarks made at the vigil. Bowers stared daggers at Ruiz from the defense table, while Green glowered with resentment. Their attorneys tried to discredit the testimony, claiming it was motivated by personal vendettas, but the evidence was too overwhelming. The visiting judge found ample grounds to proceed with a full trial. As Green and Bowers walked out of the courtroom, wearing scowls so dark they seemed almost feral, Redwood Falls looked upon them with a mixture of fear and relief. For years, these two had been the face of intimidation. Now, they were the ones on the defensive. No empire collapses in an instant. It happens in stages. First, people lose faith. Then, the system begins to tear itself apart from within. In Redwood Falls, that process was well underway. City council members, afraid of being implicated, voted to remove Captain Eddings from his position, pending the investigation. A new interim chief was sworn in, a no-nonsense woman named Chief Viola Presley, who pledged transparency and accountability from day one. She met with community leaders, acknowledging the decades of injustice. It was a start, albeit a small one. Captain Eddings didn't go quietly. He made calls, threatened lawsuits, tried to rally supporters. But in the end, his allies jumped ship, hoping to save themselves from criminal charges. Soon enough, Eddings found himself facing an inquiry for conspiracy and corruption. As for the real estate mogul Charles Fletcher, an audit of his finances revealed millions in unexplained revenue streams tied to fraudulent property deals. He, too, was in hot water. Meanwhile, the Redwood Falls PD was a patchwork of chaos. The old guard tried to cling to what was left of the power structure, but the new interim chief swiftly changed protocols. Body cams became mandatory at all times, departmental finances were opened for review, and officers with questionable records were put on leave pending further investigation. It was the single greatest shift in Redwood Falls policing since the department's founding. Green and Bowers eventually faced a jury trial. By the time it rolled around, Redwood Falls was a different city, one more alert, more vocal, and less tolerant of corruption. The prosecutor presented a devastating case, centered on the assault against Judge Reyes, supplemented by multiple instances of racially motivated misconduct. Local news outlets covered every second of the trial. As the jury deliberated, Redwood Falls held its breath. When they returned, the verdict was swift: guilty on charges of aggravated battery and official misconduct. The brandishing charge was folded into the official misconduct count due to legal technicalities, but nonetheless, the consequences loomed large. Green and Bowers were sentenced to multiple years in state prison and stripped of their badges for life. Weeks after the trial, Redwood Falls breathed a collective sigh of relief. The empire, while not entirely eradicated, was severely weakened. Many involved faced trials of their own. Some took plea deals, while others would fight in court. But the old system of intimidation no longer reigned supreme. Redwood Falls was on a new path. Judge Reyes was pivotal in this transformation. While she wasn't personally involved in prosecuting Green and Bowers, her refusal to be intimidated inspired countless residents. After the dust settled, she found herself standing at the front steps of the courthouse on a sunny afternoon, addressing a crowd. "We cannot erase history," she told them, her voice echoing across the courtyard. "But we can learn from it. We must hold each other accountable, citizens, officers, politicians. Let this be a lesson that no one is above the law, and that we all have a role in making Redwood Falls a place of justice and equality." The crowd erupted in applause. Many people had never seen Redwood Falls band together like this, united against corruption. The future felt uncertain but hopeful. Sergeant Haas, who had quietly aided the investigation by cooperating with the state attorney general, was promoted to deputy chief under Viola Presley. Though he bore internal scars from years of working under a corrupt system, he believed in the department's capacity to change. Officer Ruiz continued her service, becoming a liaison with community groups who once feared the police. In time, Redwood Falls PD saw a shift from intimidation to outreach. Captain Eddings's trial was slated for the following year, where he'd face charges ranging from conspiracy to intimidation of witnesses. Real estate mogul Charles Fletcher saw his empire crumble as well, with property after property seized under civil forfeiture laws tied to fraudulent practices. And as for Madeline Green and Harriet Bowers, they languished in prison, their dreams of unchallenged dominance shattered. Once feared as living symbols of Redwood Falls' dark underbelly, they now faced the stark reality of living without the power they had so callously abused. Life in Redwood Falls gradually returned to a semblance of normalcy, but it was a new normal, one shaped by heightened civic engagement, community oversight, and a renewed sense of responsibility. Judge Reyes remained at her post, continuing to preside over cases with unwavering fairness. She knew her work was far from done. Corruption might be wounded, but if left unchecked, it could always rear its head again. One evening, as Reyes walked down the main street, she noticed how differently locals greeted her. Before, they might have offered polite nods. Now, she received warm smiles, waves, even words of gratitude. The Redwood River glimmered under the setting sun, reflecting the changing skyline. The tension that once permeated the air had dissipated, replaced by cautious optimism. Of course, Redwood Falls would always bear scars from this chapter. Families uprooted by Fletcher's real estate schemes still struggled to rebuild their lives. Officers who had complied with or turned a blind eye to racist policies grappled with guilt. But the city had, at last, confronted its demons and taken real steps toward accountability. Now, my friends, as we reach the conclusion of this gripping tale, I want to thank you for staying with me through every twist and turn. If this story resonates with you, if it's a reminder of how speaking out and standing for justice can topple even the mightiest walls of corruption, please take a moment to drop a like on this video. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you never miss another powerful story like this one. Before you go, let me know in the comments, where are you tuning in from? And what do you think is the most important takeaway from Redwood Falls' journey? Remember, just because this story took place in a fictional city doesn't mean it can't mirror realities happening in towns across the world. The names of officers might be different. The scale of corruption might vary. But the principle stands. When communities unite, when justice is pursued without fear, empires built on prejudice and power imbalances will always, inevitably, crumble. So stay vigilant, support fairness, and never underestimate the power of a single person, be it a judge, a concerned citizen, or even an honest police officer, to spark meaningful change. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.